Today, I'd like to talk about household batteries and grid congestion management. Um, just to introduce myself quickly, I'm a teacher and researcher at the Hansa University of Applied Sciences in Groningen in the Netherlands. And I'm also a PhD candidate at the Technical University of Eindhoven. So it's a bit of a collaboration between the applied sciences and the more fundamental sciences. And my research is focusing on congestion in low and medium voltage distribution grids, with a particular emphasis on residential areas. So that's what I'm going to discuss today, and and the role that batteries can play in this area. So I've separated this into roughly three different topics. So first of all, looking at what is grid congestion, why is it occurring, and why do we expect it to continue to get worse? How we can address grid congestion issues, specifically looking at batteries, but also considering some other alternatives. And then I want to finally wrap up with a project that I'm working on right now called No Gizmos, which is a practical use case of household batteries, how we can use household batteries to manage grid congestion, and what that project entails. So to start with, let's define the problem. This is, for anyone in the Netherlands, this is a familiar picture. We see that grid congestion is becoming a serious issue. This is not only a Dutch problem, this is occurring throughout Europe. As this recent IEA report about grid stability or grid security has shown, that grid congestion is becoming an increasing problem. So on the left-hand side here are areas in the Netherlands where they have little or no room on the medium voltage grid for new large consumers, so industry in particular. Of course, households are usually fine. On the right-hand side, there's no medium voltage grid capacity available for new producers. So we're talking about, again, solar panels on your roof, that's probably fine. But if you want a solar park or a small onshore wind park, there's just no capacity available. So this is, of course, a problem. You can see huge areas of the country are just unavailable for electrification. So as we go forward, this this problem is not going to get better on its own. It's probably going to get worse, and this has to do with developments in residential areas. Currently, the Netherlands is the leading country in the world with rooftop solar PV per capita due to good subsidy schemes. They have a lot of rooftop solar PV. And you can see the installed capacity in the Netherlands is quite high. It's over 2,000 megawatts, or sorry, over 20,000 megawatts. And roughly half of this is rooftop PV. The Netherlands has a pretty strong subsidy scheme where you sell your PV for the same rate that you buy it at. So essentially, you can sell your PV energy. You can use the electricity grid as a giant battery. So it's a very good subsidy. So there's buying rooftop solar is really a no-brainer decision for people. So they have a lot of it. But of course, this will cause some problems because electricity from PV tends to generate around the same time, typically between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock. So you have a large peak in production that quickly tails off. Another problem is larger PV plants tend to be installed in rural areas, which have historically in the Netherlands have pretty weak electricity grids. There's a couple of reasons for this, but primarily the Netherlands uses natural gas for heating, which is around 80% of household energy consumption. As a result, the electricity grid is much weaker than you might have in France or something. So this is potentially one contributing part of the problem is we have an increasing amount of PV energy. And this is not only a case in the Netherlands, but if we look at Europe in general, sorry, a small typo here, but IEA expects, this is the heat pumps. But anyway, we expect a lot of PV coming online in countries around Europe. Heat pumps is a similar story. we expected a large increase in heat pumps. If you look at this projection from IEA, they're expecting roughly 7 million heat pumps in Europe by 2030, a lot of them in existing buildings and then some in new buildings. And a lot of these are expected to be in residences as well. So in the periphery of the electricity grid. Of course, industry also uses heat pumps, but we expect a large part of this to be in housing. And you can see that with this graph from the Netherlands, the light blue bars are the number of heat pumps installed in residential sector or in the residential sector, whereas the dark blue is industry and other small businesses. So you'll see that the number of heat pumps in residential sector is growing quite rapidly. There's nearing 1 million as of 2021, but now surpassing 1 million. This has some advantages, of course, because heat pumps save you a lot of direct energy use, primary energy use. But there are some problems, potential problems. A heat pump roughly doubles the electricity consumption of a house every year. And they have a relatively high simultaneity, which means that they tend to run at the same time. So this can be a problem because if typically your electricity consumption is spread more or less evenly over the year, but with heat pumps, you're clustering a lot of energy use into small periods of cold climate or cold periods. And a third factor is up and coming is electric vehicles. So we expect, of course, a lot of electric vehicles coming in the coming years. And a lot of these are going to be charged at home, most likely. So again, as with heat pumps, electric vehicles will generally, on average, double a household's electricity consumption. So if you have heat pumps and electric vehicles in a house, you're looking at tripling your consumption. If you have 2 electric vehicles, then quadrupling your electricity consumption. EVs also tend to have a high simultaneity. As they're being used now, people tend to arrive home from work, plug them in, and you'll see a large peak from 5 to 7 p.m. where everyone plugs their electric vehicles at the same time, and everyone wants to charge as soon as they get home. Just to put it in context, Netherlands is expecting roughly 2 million personal electric vehicles by 2030, currently sitting at around 200,000, but this is growing quite quickly. This year, I think they had 20% of new sales were electric vehicles, and that's only increasing. So it's in some ways, it's a good sign that energy transition is accelerating, but on the other hand, it could be problematic for the electricity grid. So I just want to explain a bit about simultaneity factor. So in this equation, G is the simultaneity factor. So if I look at a section of the grid, let's say a transformer station, and I have a number of residences connected to this transformer, then my simultaneity factor is the ratio of the maximum load at my transformer, that's the nominator here, PS value, and the denominator is the peak electricity use or peak electricity generation of each individual house over a year. So typically, your peak electricity use from your house and your neighbor's house will not align, and that would be a very low simultaneity factor. However, if you do happen to have a peak electricity use at the same time, then you'd have a very high simultaneity factor, a factor of 100%. And of course, as you have 100 or 200 houses, then this number tends to vary. But just for some context, a typical traditional neighborhood in the Netherlands, which uses gas for heating, no electric vehicles, no solar panels, they have a simultaneity factor of 20%. So that means on average, in a year, only 20% of your houses will have a peak consumption at the same time. So it's pretty low. What this means in practice is the amount of electricity demand at any given moment is quite spread out, quite evenly distributed over the year. However, when we start introducing new factors, such as rooftop PV, we start to see these simultaneity factors increasing. Or for rooftop PV, we talk about generation simultaneity. So the PV tends to generate electricity at the same time. I think it's pretty logical. So the simultaneity here is between 50 and 90%, depending on how the rooftops are oriented. So if all your rooftops are in a row with all the same orientation, then you expect very high simultaneity. So every PV panel is generating at the same time, which puts a big spike of power on the grid. If you have more varied household orientations, then this will be different. Electric vehicle charging, as I mentioned before, its simultaneity is around 50%. People tend to come home, charge their vehicles at the same time. So you'll see a big spike around 5 to 7 p.m. And heat pumps, it varies. Again, it depends on mostly on household insulation. So a well-insulated house, they have less energy demand for heating in general. So your heat pump doesn't run as frequently. So you have a lower simultaneity, around 30%. But in less well-insulated homes, the heat pump is running more often. So you're more likely to coincide with your neighbor's consumption. So then you see simultaneity rising to 50, maybe 60%. Why does all of this even matter? We're going to illustrate this with some examples to hopefully explain it a bit more. But the basic fundamental problem here is not only that we're consuming more electricity or generating more electricity in the case of PV, but that we're doing it all at the same time. And that's what's leading to a lot of congestion on the grid. So there's a lot of ways to address grid congestion. I mean, you can curtail PV generation. So you can say, instead of letting the PV make a big spike of generation at one moment, which can overload your grid components, you could have curtailment. So you cut off the PV generation at a certain level. There's a PV park here in the local area where they curtail by 30%. That means they reduce the highest moment of production in the year by 30%. So they're not putting so much power on the grid at the peak times. And this results in an annual loss of 5 to 6% of energy generation. So actually, because PV is so particular in its generation patterns, you can curtail on the most extreme days, and you don't actually lose very much energy generation over a year, but you can radically reduce the magnitude of the load that you're putting on the grid. So this is one solution. You can, of course, also coordinate your electric vehicles and heat pumps in such a way that they don't coordinate over time, so that you run them at different times. This is already being done on a local level, but you could also look at this from maybe a more national level, or more from a regulatory perspective, how you can institute this, not just in a pilot project, but make it more consistent. And essentially, the idea here is that no two electric, or let's say you have 10 electric vehicles, that half can charge from 6 p.m. to 12 p.m., and then the other half can charge from 12 a.m. to 7 a.m. So you split them up a little bit so that they don't all charge at the same time. And this has the advantage of reducing your peak loads on the grid. And of course, what we're here to talk about today is batteries. Batteries, of course, can move energy in time. So you can charge your PV energy and then use it again at nighttime. And this has a big advantage, is that it actually reduces the amount of electricity transport you need. The previous option of shifting the times when the electric vehicles charge, that's all well and good for reducing the peak load, but you still need to bring all that electricity in to your local grid. Whereas a battery system can reduce the amount of electricity you need to import. So that's a big advantage in this system. So today I'd like to discuss batteries in particular, but these other solutions, and of course there are many more, we'll just keep those in mind, because ultimately it's probably an interplay of all of these solutions that will help us resolve grid congestion issues. So just to put everything in a little more context, to give it a little more visual nature, let's look at a neighborhood. These are actual measurements from a neighborhood of 136 houses here in the Netherlands. And this is the measurements at a transformer. This black line shows the electricity consumption for this neighborhood for a day in December. So the black line is showing how much that neighborhood's consuming, and you see it's around 80 to 150 kilowatts on average. Pretty low simultaneity. There's not very many big peaks. So this is what you typically see in the residential area in the Netherlands and most countries. Now, let's say we want to add some PV to this neighborhood, this neighborhood has very ambitious goals to participate in energy transition. So they want to add a lot of PV, electric vehicles, and heat pumps. So this is a simulated result of some PV. This is in December, so we don't expect a lot of PV on the load, but we'll just add that in there. We'll add some heat pumps. Heat pumps have a relatively high load. These are relatively poor insulated houses, so they consume quite a bit for heating. So that's why the load is so high, essentially doubling the house's electricity consumption. And then we add in electric vehicles as well. This is the green line here. So this is adding 95 electric vehicles to a community of 136 houses. So we're not even reaching that 100% EV ownership rate. But you can see this is already adding a lot of electricity consumption needs to the neighborhood. If we add all these load patterns together, then we get this blue line. So you can see that we've gone from consuming around 150 kilowatts at the peak moment to over 750. So almost tripling or more than tripling our electricity demand, or the impact of electricity consumption on the grid. The actual demand is much less. That's the area under the curve. But the peak moment, the time when everything coincides, when you charge your electric vehicle, you're heating your house at the same time, and you're cooking, for example. So you have your normal base load. All of these add up to result in a very high peak on the grid. In this particular case, the red line here represents the actual grid capacity in the neighborhood. So they have a transformer station with around 280 kilowatt capacity. So you'll see that that's woefully inadequate for this forecasted scenario that we're looking at. And to be able to prevent the grid from overloading, you have to drastically shift your loads around. So yeah, we see here there's frequent overloading in this scenario, although it's not the end of the world. With a battery, it is possible to reduce these loads, the dashed blue line, down to a level below the grid capacity. This is the dark blue line here. So we've proven this with simulations by shifting the loads and possibly pre-charging the battery the day before, or a battery system the day before. It is possible to maintain grid loading below a certain, or this value. Now, you may be wondering, okay, you could use batteries to do this, but you could equally install a larger transformer so that you move this red line up essentially. And that's historically what grid operators have done. So it's a very common solution, especially if in such an extreme scenario. It's probably the most logical solution. You could just add a new transformer. And in this case, that's actually what was performed. The grid operator installed a new transformer of 600 kilowatts. So essentially going from 280 to 880. So they'd have sufficient capacity. But that is not always the best solution. First of all, grid reinforcement costs a lot of money. And more importantly, it takes a lot of time. At the moment, it takes about 6 months to reinforce a section of the low or medium voltage grid. Well, the low voltage grid, medium voltage grid takes 1 to 2 years. But this amount of time needed to upgrade the grid is increasing dramatically. I've heard from the local grid operator here that the number of instances where they've had to reinforce the grid has increased tenfold in the last 2 years, and they just can't keep up with this. So the amount of time it needs for planning and implementing grid upgrades, you have to, in the Netherlands, all your cables are underground, so you have to dig up the street, replace the cables, buy and install a new transformer, design the system. They just can't keep pace with the rate of problems that they're encountering. So this is where batteries could be a solution, or at least a temporary solution, to prevent overloading on the electricity grid. The other reason you might not want to reinforce the grid is it's not very inefficient. This is a picture of a load duration curve. So you'll see here on the left side, that's your peak consumption value. On the right side, your peak generation value from PV. And so this is over the entire year, how much electricity you're importing or exporting to this neighborhood. So the positive values are imports, the negative values are exports. And so it's every moment in time ordered from highest to lowest. What is the power being transported on the grid at that moment? And you'll see that actually the moments where you're reaching the grid capacity are very small. You're only looking at maybe a few dozen hours a year, maybe 100 hours over a whole year where you're actually reaching these extreme values. So if you upgrade the electricity grid to account for these extremes, you actually have much more capacity than you need most of the time. So it's not very cost efficient. Rather, you could, say, install a battery to handle these peak load problems in the worst moments of the year, and then use the battery for other purposes for the rest of the year. Then you're not installing all those extra cables, all these extra transformers that are only really needed for, those worst few hours a year. I think there are some questions in the chat, so let me just no questions. Okay. So I think this gives a bit of motivation for why we should actually use batteries for grid congestion. It helps keep your generated PV production local, so you don't need to transport so much. That also means less losses. You always lose 5 to 10% when you're transporting electricity. And you also don't overinvest in your grid, which is also a potential danger, I think, potential risk. So if we're going to use batteries, let's imagine a scenario where a government subsidizes household batteries. They already do this in some countries. How do we expect these batteries to act? And will they help solve grid congestion problems or not? Let's take this basic scenario. Assume we have some electricity consumption pattern following this dashed blue line. So again, positive values are net consumption, negative values are net generation. And assume that the market price is more or less following this pattern. Just rough assumption. How will a battery act in this scenario? Well, there are 2 or 3 main ways that a battery is programmed to behave. I'll talk about greedy batteries, batteries that act in the self-interest of a household. One methodology is self-consumption oriented. So essentially, you want to use as much of your PV energy yourself as possible. So your solar panels generate energy, and you're going to charge your battery with that generated energy, and then you're going to discharge your battery when you start consuming. This is a very basic algorithm. Essentially, we charge when we have net production, we discharge when we have net consumption. And you'll see what happens here is we charge the batteries before we can do anything about our peak generation of PV. And we do manage to offset the peak consumption in the evening, but not the next morning, because our battery is already empty by the next morning. You can also look at a price control mechanism. So in this case, the battery wants to charge when the price is lowest and discharge when the price is highest. And then you get this kind of pattern, the yellow line here. So you'll see that here, actually, we do hit some of the peak PV generation, but not all of it. And we do hit, again, some of the peak consumption in the household, but again, not all of it. So these very generic battery control algorithms, they will achieve the goal for the house owner, but they don't help the grid by reducing that peak power flow on the cables, on the transformer. An alternative here is to limit battery power to 20%. So you say, okay, for each hour, you can only discharge or charge 20% of your capacity. And this has the effect of smoothing out the battery operation over a longer period. If we look at the self-consumption scenario, here it takes longer for the battery to charge, which means on days with a lot of PV energy, you can shave that peak down quite a bit. And same with discharging. You discharge over a longer period, which reduces your peak consumption quite a bit. Downside to this strategy, of course, is it might not always be possible to fully charge or discharge your battery, depending on how much PV energy is available. We could do the same thing with the price control battery. Say, okay, you're limited to how much power you can use for each hour, how much energy you can charge or discharge every hour. And here we actually see it quite effectively reducing the peak PV generation here by going from the blue line to the green line. And also on the consumption side, you can pretty significantly reduce your peaks. So by limiting the battery power and using a price control mechanism, it is possible to have the battery reduce grid congestion indirectly. However, this is not necessarily the best solution. If we let the DSOs control the battery, the DSO is the distribution system operator, so the grid operator, low voltage, medium voltage grid operator, then they are much more effective at reducing these peaks but again, they have a different goal. So this is a bit of a trade-off. We can more effectively reduce peaks on the grid if the DSO can control batteries, but it might not serve the battery owner's interest quite as effectively. This is a bit of a balancing act here. Yeah, similar idea for wind turbine patterns, but same idea.
We do have a first question in the chat now,
okay. Yes.
Which is about the idea of basically moving the electric vehicle charging to around midnight to just, you know. So how about that?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that is definitely part of the solution to distribute electric vehicle charging over a longer period. That will certainly help resolve some of these problems. But it doesn't address the more fundamental issue that the amount of electricity you need to import is going to be increasing because you still need to bring all that electricity into your neighborhood. And typically your transformer station, your low to medium voltage transformer, that's typically your bottleneck. So if you can keep electricity generation and consumption within a low voltage grid, that's generally more efficient and causing less congestion problems than if you have to import it from outside that area. This goes into the idea of energy communities and energy, where a small community is more, we say energy self-sufficient or partially energy self-sufficient. But certainly shifting electric vehicle loads is part of the solution, but it's not entirely the solution. But thank you for your question. So this raises so going from this example, we can compare here 3 different scenarios. Self-consumption can potentially help reduce peak loads on the grid, but not necessarily. Using limited power, you can spread things out, spread your battery use over time, which helps more. But the DSO control is, of course, the best solution because they know where the congestion problems are, so they can coordinate batteries appropriately. But this does lead to some questions. So to what extent can household batteries actually reduce congestion in practice? Because in the model, of course, it's easy, but in reality, it's not so easy. And what is the impact of allowing the DSO to control batteries? What is the impact on the owner of the battery, both in financial terms, but also in other metrics? And you could apply the same idea to electric vehicles. So this goes back to the previous question. If the DSO can change your charging pattern of your electric vehicle, how does that impact you as a consumer? And finally, more general question, are household batteries an effective solution for energy transition problems and a cost-effective solution? Technically, they're quite effective, but is it cost-effective? So these are all questions we intend to answer in the No Gizmos project. So this is a project here in the Netherlands funded by, well, it's a partner project with industry and the Dutch government Top Sector Energy, which is providing financing for this project. And yeah, we want to look at how household batteries and potentially electric vehicles as well, how DSO control of these assets can help reduce grid congestion. Some project partners, of course, the Hansa University of Applied Sciences, where I work, and Technical University of Eindhoven. CGI is providing the technical data management and data handling system. IEA is a battery producer here in the Netherlands who are providing the batteries. Annexus is the local grid operator, and Onsen Aardgasvrij Energiekansen, this is the local energy cooperative. So Energiekansen, they have the goal of installing more PV plants in the local area, but they can't do this at the moment because of grid congestion. So we're looking at, okay, if they had some household batteries and the DSO were able to control these, could we free up some grid capacity so they could install more PV? So that's kind of the ultimate goal of this project. We've done some measurements over the past year. So we can see the medium voltage grid, the power flows here. So positive values are net consumption, negative values are net production, so exports. So you can see the consumption is really not a problem in Onsen. They have a lot of PV energy, and we can see on summer and spring days, they are generating a lot of PV, especially in that 12 to 3 o'clock period. And this is actually what's causing the congestion on the grid. So it's not as if the grid is always full in this case. It's only during these key moments when the PV is generating a lot. And that's preventing them from installing more PV in the region. So the basic architecture of No Gizmos is we have 140 kilowatt hours of household batteries installed. Energy Islands is kind of our aggregator, this is the CGI platform. And this is kind of acts as a communication hub where data from the batteries, from the grid operator, and from all other sources is all accumulated, and then some solution is found where we can steer the batteries to reduce congestion. So you have the batteries here, which communicate via IWell to the aggregator platform. You have some day-ahead algorithm, that's what I'm working on at the moment, to plan how the battery should act in the coming day to reduce congestion. And we have data from the grid operator, some measurement data, some forecast data to determine how large of a congestion problem we expect in the coming day. So if I look at the worst day last year, I say worst, the day with the most PV generation, not necessarily the worst, but the day with the highest loading on the grid, we can come to this image. These were data on the medium voltage grid in that region, take on 5-minute resolution. So we see we're exceeding 800 kilowatts, which is more or less the capacity of the grid here. So it's a pretty low capacity grid. The transformer is 1 megawatt. If you include reactive power flows and account for energy losses and things, you're expecting, 800 is getting pretty close to the maximum load that you would want on that section of the grid. So this is congestion. We would say the DSO will not allow more PV on the grid because this value here, this 2 or 3 hours of peak generation is too high. If we just install the batteries and let them act on their own, let's say for self-consumption, say it's a greedy battery, then those batteries, that 140 kilowatt hours, is going to charge very quickly in the morning as soon as we start generating PV. It's going to do nothing for this peak generation. So the batteries are fill up much too quickly to address the congestion problem. However, if we look at a more collective solution, so the DSO intervenes and says you have to shift your battery charging by several hours, then we can reduce the peak here quite significantly. So rough calculation, 125 kilowatt hour of batteries, we can reduce the peak by 29%. So that essentially means we're freeing up 30% of our grid capacity by using 125 kilowatt hour installed battery capacity, which is pretty significant. So you can essentially install double your solar panel installations in this region with 125 kilowatt hours of batteries. Well, at the moment, this is still being simulated, but we're going to intend to do this in practice this coming year. So the batteries are currently being installed. We expect to have them ready by the end of March. And then we're going to start testing to see how effectively we can actually use these batteries to reduce congestion and how much we can reduce congestion. And also how that impacts the, let's say, the normal operation of the batteries. So how it affects the owners. So the research aims of this project: how much can we reduce grid congestion using household batteries? How often do we need to intervene? How often would the DSO need to intervene with the normal battery operation in order to manage grid congestion? And how does that affect the owner? So if you're using a price control system, maybe you have to pay a bit more, or you earn a bit less from your battery. So that might be an impact. Or maybe your battery doesn't charge completely in the day, so you don't retain as much of your PV energy. That could be another impact. And then a bit of a follow-up question: what other grid services can household batteries provide in practice? So we're thinking about in the following year, so in 2025, looking at grid voltage control. So using batteries to manage grid voltage on the distribution grid. And can we use these same techniques to mitigate the negative impacts of other developments like electric vehicle charging and heat pump control? So using the same architecture, can we steer electric vehicles to charge in a more grid-friendly way? These are some of the aims of this project. So household batteries, in conclusion, they might or they might not help grid congestion. It all depends on how you regulate them, how you control them. Currently, there's no clear regulations on DSO control of batteries. There's an EU regulation that DSOs are not allowed to own and operate batteries themselves. But if you act through a third party, this is probably allowed, but it's not very clearly defined. And it's currently not clear what the costs and benefits of the DSO control of batteries will be, both for the grid operator and the battery owner. So of course, there's going to be some trade-offs here. Is it worthwhile for the DSO to steer batteries in this way, or is it better to just invest in some alternative solutions? That is also something that's not clear. So yeah, thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, first of all, and yeah, still questions. Does anyone have any? Because if no one has one, then I just go myself for the first question. Because you mentioned that it's just something I find interesting, the day ahead algorithm that you're working on. I feel like how do you do that? How do you like what do you look at in order to forecast something as hard to guess as energy consumption? I mean, there's so much going in there. How do you work on that?
That's a great question. There's a couple of techniques being used. So how the DSO approaches this is they use historical data. When we're looking at a high level, aggregated level, like a medium voltage grid, it tends to be fairly consistent from year to year. So you might look at a period of the year, say the summer period. That's likely to be quite consistent for at least historically. But that gets thrown out of whack when you add in things like PV, which changes drastically from day to day. So then you're looking at weather forecasts. So it's a mix of forecasting and backcasting, which you use to try to evaluate what will happen in the next day. It's not a perfect science because on such a fine detail, of course, you're going to have a lot of, on this scale, it's harder to do, but it's not as hard as, say, predicting an individual household. We're looking at medium voltage grid, which is already like 1,000 or more houses. So you're already aggregating some data in that sense.
Yeah, that's probably very true. The fact that you're looking at a large number of households and not just one. So we have.
I would just like to add to that. We're actually considering using a bit of a real-time feedback system to fine-tune our predictions. So we'll have our day-ahead forecast, but then looking at grid voltage variation over the day, we might make some adjustments to the plan. So if the voltage starts getting too high or too low, we'll adjust the battery pattern.
You can still, all right, that's
So
pretty
a
cool.
bit of real-time feedback. I think, well, that's our hypothesis. Some real-time feedback could help to improve the performance.
Yeah, I mean, you'll see, that's science, you know?
Yeah.
All right, we have another question in the chat, and then Harald Mieling having his hand up. We'll take the question from the chat first. Oh, there's also the question, the usual question. Is the presentation available? If you could send it to me, Chris, then I can put it on the website. It'll
Yeah, for
be
sure.
at events, just with the latest OnSeminar appointments, and you'll find it there. I'll upload it there. And also, the question from the chat would be any comments on the hybrid electric and thermal building storage solutions to help the grid congestion? So, yeah, electric and thermal, that's always
that's a
interesting.
great point, I think. Electricity storage is, I think, much more difficult to achieve than battery storage, but it also achieves a different aim. But I think thermal storage is very important. We talked about heat pumps here. The more thermal storage you have, the better you can reduce the impact of heat pumps on the grid, for sure. This doesn't really translate so well with electric vehicles or PV, but there's some potential there. Yeah, especially coordinating PV with heat pumps. If you can store that heat, you can use that PV electricity to run your heat pump and then store that heat locally. That's great. I think some of the problems with these technologies is it takes more planning and time to implement, whereas the DSOs are having a lot of problems currently. They cannot, batteries are very easy and quick to install. So that's an advantage on that side. You can throw a battery into a household within a month or two, no problem. Well, sometimes there are problems, but as a technical solution, it's quite easy to implement. You don't need to completely renovate a household to accommodate it.
That is true. But yeah. All right, then Harald Mieling was the first one to have his hand up. Harald,
Okay.
please.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay,
we do.
perfect. You said quite early that there is still quite some demand from using heat pumps in not so well insulated buildings. And what I think is always the best is reduce the problem before and then solves the rest. So insulating buildings should be economic anyway. Then when you have insulated it, you reduce also the size of the heat pump, which reduces cost, and then reduces the problem that you discussed. So the question is basically, is there any pressure to improve the insulation of not well insulated buildings, and what could be the contribution? Would it be significant, or did you just mention it but it's in a percent range?
That's a great question. Insulation, I think it really varies from country to country. It depends on subsidy schemes. In the Netherlands, it's your heat pump subsidy is not tied to your insulation at all. So you get the subsidy regardless. So it just varies from country to country, I think. But I do agree, of course, reducing your heat demand should be your priority. However, even if you do insulate a house, like an old house, say from the 1930s or 1940s, it's not going to achieve that same level as a newly built house today. So even insulating as much as you can, an old house you'll still need 20 or 30% more heat than a newer, more efficient house.
Yeah, but is the fraction of the houses that are not well insulated, is that really or is that a bigger fraction, so that an improved insulation would really reduce the demand and thereby also then with heat pumps the peak on the electricity demand? Or is it only a small fraction? Because I think in Germany we still have quite a number of houses which are not well insulated. So I think in Germany, if we would have a problem on the electricity demand in the houses, I would first insulate the houses better and then reduce the heating demand. And if you supply the heat by electricity, then at the same time reduce the peak electricity demand.
Yes, that's the same problem here in the Netherlands. I think basically any house built before 2010 is probably poorly insulated. They only had regulations since I think around 2010, 2009 maybe. So it's almost probably 90% of the housing stock needs to be insulated. So that is a challenge, but there are subsidy schemes for that. But heat pumps, even if you do reduce the total thermal heating demand, actually a lot of the peak heating demand from heat pump comes from hot water for showers. So that's something that doesn't really matter, doesn't really depend on insulation. So that's kind of it's a bit of a different issue, but it is related. But the peak demand and so where you get most heat pumps producing a lot or consuming a lot of electricity around the same time tends to be in the early morning when it's heating up hot water for your showers. And that's
but this is an easy to solve problem.
well,
I mean, it's basically what the question before was, because the high demand on heating power that you need for a shower or a bath, you can easily buffer with a hot water tank.
Yeah. So if you have larger hot water tanks that you can buffer over a longer period, that definitely helps to address this issue. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
But I think it's important to note, I think all of these solutions are parts of a whole. You're not going to you're not going to completely get rid of grid congestion by having more hot water tanks. You probably need a mixture of different ideas. Batteries alone aren't going to solve your problems either. You're probably going to need a mixture of different solutions to achieve what you want.
Very true. Very true. There's also Pierre who had a question.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I had a question. What are your thoughts on the shared batteries? In your simulation, did you distinguish what is better between putting only one battery, so 120 kilowatt hour, if I understand well, with scale effects, compared to one distributed batteries in household? So one batteries between and compared to distributed batteries.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what Pierre is referring to is you could have one central battery or community battery that's more centrally located in your village or your neighborhood versus several batteries, small household batteries spread out over your neighborhood. There's a lot of advantages to a community battery. So it's easier to aggregate the power flows at a higher level because you don't have such large peaks in demand and consumption. Battery can be used more efficiently. It can be fully charged and discharged more frequently, so you can use it more effectively. And it tends to be cheaper on a per kilowatt hour basis. So on a capacity basis, larger batteries tend to be cheaper because you don't need so many components for inverters and housing. The downside of a community battery is more of a more of a financing issue. If you have a household battery that you're using for self-consumption, all your PV energy that you charge in the battery and you use yourself, that stays behind the meter, so you don't pay anything for it. Whereas with a community battery, with the current financial structures, this you can change, but currently you would have to pay energy to inject power onto the grid to send it to your community battery, and then pay again when you get it back. So you have to pay twice instead of 0 times. So it's kind of it's a problem with a solution, but that is, I think, a big stumbling block for these systems at the moment, is that you have to pay too much in taxes. You get taxed twice on your energy versus 0 times for a household battery.
So it will be the DSO to make this choice for
government
shared battery.
It's a government regulation. It's a regulation problem at the moment. And but I think that is a challenge that's easy to overcome. And another problem with community batteries, I shouldn't say a problem, but a challenge, is finding a space for it. We were actually considering installing a community battery in this project I mentioned, but it was very difficult to find a location for it because they're quite large. It's about the size of a sea container. And where do you put it? It's a challenge. How do you place it in your community? And you want it in a place that's effective and technically for the grid layout, but you can't just stick it in the middle of the street or something. So it's another challenge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very clear. Thank you.
Yeah, but thank you. That's a good question. There's trade-offs with these two different systems, and yeah, I don't know what's better or worse. It's they both have advantages and disadvantages.
Yes. As with everything, Harald is having his hand back up. I think.
Yes. I first had another question, and that was why put the batteries in the households? Because small batteries are costly. And my first thought was to put it close to the transformer, but then I realized that is technically not possible because the voltage is completely different. But now what came to my mind was I don't know, you probably heard about Carnot batteries, right?
Yes, yeah.
So basically you use the electricity to run a heat pump or a direct electric resistance heater, convert it to high temperature thermal energy storage, and then run Carnot cycle or whatever. And with this, you basically can bypass the problem of the voltage. And it's, let's say, the energetic efficiency is not good yet. I think they reach 50-60% if they are lucky. But still, it's an upcoming technology with some potential, I think. Do you also look into this? Because this would be a way to maybe buffer the peaks and a lot of other things in the grid.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. I think there's a lot of interesting energy storage technologies that are coming forward. We also have salt batteries, for example, so they have much less environmental impact. So there's a lot of different ideas in this regard. For this No Gizmos project, we needed something that's commercially available. So that's why we went with lithium-ion based household batteries. And also regarding installing it at the household, it's just much easier because you don't need a separate grid connection. You don't need a new meter or something. You can just go to the household, install the battery. There's no regulatory problems. So just in terms of practicality, household batteries are much easier with the current regulations. But you're right, they are more expensive relatively. So that's the downside. But we wanted to test more, let's say, more abstract level control ideas using some form of energy storage, and household batteries are just the most easily achieved at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, they also have the advantage that in case of power failure, you have a backup, for example. There is
potentially that's a bit of a tricky one.
Yeah, but basically there's advantages which are not connected to grid stability and so on.
Yes.
So it really depends on the point of view.
Yeah. And for a battery owner, it's they might have different interests. What we found actually, most battery owners don't care at all about earning money with their battery. At least the people we've interviewed, it's a small sample, but from the sample we've interviewed, they're more concerned with self-consumption, to be more energy independent. That's their goal. They don't want to be reliant on the electricity grid. So that is,
Yeah, and the economics is not the problem.
No, for most people, that's not the problem. Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
All right. That was interesting. That was just interesting to me.
Good.
Any other questions on that? Any different ideas? And does not seem like it at the moment. Well, that is beautiful, because that means 3 minutes to 3, and we can wrap this up. Thank you all for being here.